All right, here we go. Good evening. Hope you're all doing well. Today we are learning Maseches, Nedarim, Daf, Kav. We're starting at a new Mishnah on the bottom of Kav Zayin and base 3 lines from the bottom. We've been discussing Nedarim of Onsin. Remember the case we discussed yesterday. A neder that you say, or a neder was made about you, you need to be here for my house for dinner, and then the river overflowed. But the neder itself was well intended, but there was a technical thing that got in the way, a secondary thing that got in the way. What if be'etzem the neder was an ones? Someone forced you to make a neder. That's our case over here. Nodrin, says the Mishnah, if a person makes a neder, and the person who forced you to make the neder was lehargin, lecharamenu lemochsin, someone who is a murderer, someone who steals, or a tax collector, and you want to lie to get out of that circumstance. You say a neder to get out of that circumstance, and you lie and say, no, don't take my food. After all, shehi truma. The food that you're trying to take is truma. It's inedible to you. Fascinating that the guy doesn't mind killing you, but if you tell him it's truma, he won't eat the food. Yeah, that's the ukimta of our heseds. That's basic shot in the Mishnah. The guy is he's a pickaxe murderer who is makbid on halachos of truma v'tara when it comes to truma. So afal pi she'ena truma, you're allowed to say that even though it's not truma. Why? Because that guy he's a crook. You're not allowed to force someone to give something away. You're not allowed to do that. The Gemara is going to ask about tax collection. It's a big shiur that's going to come up in the Gemara. Okay, you can also say shehein shel beis hamelech. I've already consecrated this food to be for the beis hamelech. You're not allowed to take it. And afal pi she'ein shel beis melech, no problem at all. You're allowed to basically make that neder when you're forced to make that neder, but the neder is really not chal, because when you're forced to make a neder, so let's say, for example, somebody says to you, if you don't promise, I will hurt you, and you promise, that's not a neder. That's what the Mishnah says. And now we're going to see a flurry of machlokos Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel, and we'll navigate these machlokos once we get started in the Gemara. Beis Shammai omrim bakol nodrin chutz mishvua. When it comes to these types of nedarim, you're allowed to make a neder, but you're not allowed to make a shvua, because a shvua is more chamor, as we learned, than a neder. What had we said about a shvua? We had said by a shvua, there's a pasuk that says lo yinakeh, that from a shvua you're always going to have to still be cleansed by a Kadosh Baruch Hu, and it's not as easy to get kapara. Beis Hillel argues, Beis Hillel omrim af b'shvua, that in these pressing circumstances you can even make a shvua. Beis Shammai omrim lo yiftach lo b'neder. You're not allowed to initiate the neder. It has to be forced upon you. The guy has to say to you, "Well, promise me that it's actually truma." So you have to first have an initiation. No, you can even initiate and just lie out of the gates. Thanks for coming. I know you want to steal everything, but I'm just letting you know it's truma. Out of the gates, no problem at all. Third line down, Kav Ches Minalef, another machlokes. You're only allowed to make a neder in regards to what that guy wanted you to make a neder. We'll see in a moment what that means. You can even add things to the neder. What is this last case talking about? This last machlokes. The Mishnah continues, Ketzad, Omar lo, if the criminal says to him, and more, promise me that this is truma by making a promise about your wife. And more, konam ishti nenesli, that I'm going to forbid my wife from access to me if this isn't truma. In other words, he's forcing you to say that it's actually truma by making a neder. So Ve'amar, what can you say? Konam ishti ubanai ne'enli. I'm going to add in more than you said. You told me to only make a neder about my wife. I'm going to show you that I'm really telling the truth, even though the whole thing's a ruse, by saying not only would my wife be answered to me if this isn't truma, but even my sons. Beis Shammai says that because you added in more than the criminal wanted you to make a neder about, so therefore ishta muteres, because that's what he asked you to make a neder about. So you have a way to get out of jail free in that regard, but in regards to the son, you don't. Unbelievable. Beis Hillel says that's not true. Really, elu ve'elu mutar. The Gemara opens with a very important halachic principle that requires so much dialogue. This is one of a number of sugyas in Shas, but it's a critical sugya to learn. How can you tell me, if you look back at the Mishnah 3 lines from the bottom, we said that a person is allowed to make a false neder and say, you can't take this money for the taxes because it's truma. Says the Gemara, opening up on Kav Ches Aleph 8 lines down, Ve'amar Shmuel, Dina de Malchusa, Dina. The law of the land is the law. So if the Baal Moches, the guy who's a tax collector, is coming to collect the money, You can't create a ruse and say, you can't take this. It's not your money. You're obligated to pay the taxes of the country that you live in. There is a shaila in Eretz Yisrael, if that's true, because there's a Ran. Is it here? I didn't think about it till right now, but I think there's a Ran that indicates, I just want to look now to see if it's actually here.
In this case,
right, no, for sure right. I was just saying the Ran says elsewhere that in regards to Eretz Yisrael, that Malka, the Kodesh Baruch Hu is Malka Da'ara. And because the Kodesh Baruch Hu is Malka Da'ara, if the Israeli government tries to charge you taxes, you don't have to pay them. There's like a sprach, there's like a mahalach, and it's based on the Rishonim. So Lemaisa, that's not the way. I spoke to my Rebbe when I was in Yeshiva, when I was in Shalvim. I spoke to my Rebbe and they said that's not correct. In Eretz Yisrael, you have to pay taxes too. It's a true government. It's a regular government. Okay, it's not the frumest government in the world. It might not be the most yasher government in the world, but you still have to pay your taxes. And taxes there are obscene. I mean, they make us feel rich by the time we're done. A tlush, you're paying 50% taxes, whatever. You have to make a killing to make it. So that's what the Gemara is bothered by. How can it be that our Mishnah is saying that you're making a false neder to get out of paying taxes? It's not allowed. The Gemara responds, Amar Rav Chinana, Amar Rav Kahana, Amar Shmuel, b'moches she'en lo kitzvah. When is it that you're allowed to create a ruse when the tax collector shows up? That's if the tax collector doesn't have a tax bracket for you. He just says, I feel like charging you $10,000 today. No, it's truma. No, you're not. We're not playing this game. That's like mafia land. Like you can't just walk in and demand a certain amount of money. That's ridiculous. The answer is no. So if there is no actual tax percentage that you're obligated to pay, one that is not made up by the tax collector, but one that's coded in the law, like we have it here within tax brackets. If you make between X and Y, your percentage is Z. If you make between A and B, your percentage is C. That's normal tax brackets, or it could be different systems. Whatever the system is, it doesn't matter. That's our system. So that's why the Gemara says it must be that in our Mishnah, we're talking about a case where the tax collector doesn't have a fixed percentage of collection. Or Debei Rav Yanai Omar b'mochas ha'omid me'elav, the tax collector. Where?
15 lines in.
The fish Eretz Yisrael Kol Yisrael Shutfin Ba. No, it's before that.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Amar Dedina Demalchus Dedina Mibnei She'eretz Shelo V'Yachol Amal. Aval b'Malchei Yisrael Lo. The fish Eretz Yisrael Kol Yisrael Shutfin Ba. Not because of what I said, but Eretz Yisrael Kol Yisrael Shutfin. Yeah. V'Chayamrin Dina Demalchus Dedina Hani Mili LeInyan She'im Kon Echad Meches Echayav Litain Lo Asam Meches B'Chaynami. Say what else? Okay. It's not exactly the language that I remember hearing about, but yeah. Anyways, there is such a shita. It's a fascinating shita. What?
If you don't pay the tax in Israel, then you're gambling from other Jews.
Not if there's no requirement to pay taxes.
No. If there is a tax and you don't pay it, then.
So the way people talk about this Ran, and again, I don't know if this is like the only Ran. Like maybe there's, I don't know, maybe there's other Chidush, I don't know exactly where it is, but this is what David just found is that even if a government charges you taxes in Eretz Yisrael, there is a shita that says it doesn't matter what they do. You are not obligated in taxes. There's no dina de malchus dina. You're not stealing from Jews. There's no taxes. They're not allowed to charge taxes in Eretz Yisrael. Who's going to pick up your garbage? It's a problem. That's why it doesn't work, because it's not like a system that funds itself, But
the other important piece there is, which is brought up all the time, right? Pay it, or I'm going to throw you out. But without that, in America, you don't get thrown out for nothing. That's
you might get thrown in jail, maybe. Okay, we're getting too political. I don't disagree, but let's move on. I mean, I do disagree, but let's move on anyways. Okay, says the Gemara, a quarter of the way down into 2 dots. We had said, Shehain shall base hamelech b'afal pi she'en shall base melech hechi nodar. What is the case where he is making this false neder? Amar Rav Amram, it must be Amar Rav, be'omer ye'asru peiros ha'olam alai, im einan shall base hamelech. I hereby forbid the fruits of the world on me, if these are not of the king's house. This is the fake neder that you made. The Gemara says that's a big problem. If you say the language of ye'asru, then they're actually going to be usher on you. Says the Gemara, Kevan de Amar Ye Asru, then Isiru Ale Kol Pira de Alma. It's not like the normal language of neder where like you're using like a homily of some kind. I hear Hare Alai Peros Ha'olam. This is different. This language is overly specific, as the Mefarish points out. And therefore, if a person says this language, that doesn't work, then Isiru Ale Kol Pira Alma. You're right, says the Gemara. It doesn't say Ye Asru, it just says Hayom, that they're going to be Asr for me today. And so instead of that, it'll just say Ye Asru HaPeros Ha'olam alai hayom im einan shel beis hamelech. So that's when he adds the word hayom. Says the Gemara, Ido Amar hayom. If a guy is going to lie to the tax collector and say the word today, he's going to be like, okay, I'll be back tomorrow. He's not going to buy that. Lo makabel minei moches. The guy is not going to even. It's a ridiculous argument. You know, when you have people who are arguing with you and there's no integrity in the argument, you're like, you're ridiculous. You're going to give me a 1-day restriction on your food. I'll be back tomorrow at 9 a.m. Get everything ready for me. So the Gemara says it can't be that it's hayom. So therefore the Gemara says, and this is a chidush atzum. Chidush atzum. The Gemara says, be'omer belibo hayom umotzi b'svasav stam. In his heart, he only takes the neder upon himself for a day. But the words that he says are stam. So in other words, it's the line that we said before in the name of Rav Amam Rav. He says, be'omer ye'asru peros ha'olam alai imin shabeis hamelech, without saying the word hayom. And he thinks in his heart hayom. And then says the Gemara and drops the bomb here. Gav the sviralon dvarim shebelev einon dvarim. Even though the feelings of your heart don't function in a contract in general, they don't function in the Nedarim in general, but legabe onsin shiny. Wow! But when it comes to an ones, dvarim shebelev are dvarim. That's a big chiddush. That's a very big chiddush and requires Rishonim to get into the meat and potatoes and understand what's it mean. Dvarim shebelev. I could have 1,000 fleeting thoughts in my heart, and we do it all the time. We're like that all the time. We're, like even Rosh Hashanah, you're sitting there going to make a Kabbalah. You think of 12 iterations of the thing that you want to work on. But they would have been binding it in ones. That's what the Gemara says. Taka, it's true. Not stam in a case, but in a case where there is an ones, the Gemara seems to say that dvarim shebelev are dvarim.
There's clearly some indication of what you think. The Gemara gives an example of hayom. Well, maybe you could have thought like,
Hashavua.
Not the word lo, not a or something.
Could have thought a lot of things.
You have to think something.
What if the words that you were thinking were bli neder?
You know what I mean? So, but that wouldn't work.
Why?
Because
it's an ones.
I'm just saying that
the whole thing is an ones. Why does he have to even think the word hayom? The whole neder is he doesn't want to make the neder.
Because if that was the case, the Gemara would have said it. The Gemara only said
hayom.
The Gemara said that he thought hayom, saying
I like your
it
diuk.
would be a bigger chiddush for the Gemara to say he thought it's not a neder.
Which would have been our first impression, actually, because he really doesn't want to make this neder. He doesn't want to do that. He's doing it because he's forced. The tax collector standing there, and he doesn't really owe taxes, so he's going to lie. He's going to say a neder that isn't really a neder. Your diuk is great. Why does it say hayom? Why doesn't it say bli neder? We haven't seen the whole bli neder thing yet, by the way. Just FYI. We have to make sure that it actually works by the time we get to the end of Nedarim. It rolls off of our tongue. I don't know. Is it in Shas? I don't know. I don't know. It may not exist. So try not to make any Nedarim in the meantime. But that's what the Gemara says, is that even though afal pi that the sphere on dvarim shebelev einon dvarim, Ladina, that doesn't count at all. Even for Doraisa things, it doesn't count. Yeah, when there's an ones, all of a sudden, Dvarim Shebelev is Dvarim. Big chiddush. Okay, this next 5 lines is the quote from our Mishnah. So I'm just going to read them quickly. Beishamai Omrim v'chulei, all of the different machlokas, Beishamai Beis Hillel, and then the last one was Beishamai Omrim b'mashu madiru, Beis Hillel Omrim b'she'enu madiru, and what was that machlokas in our Mishnah? Ketzad, halfway down, Amar lo konam ishti nehenesli, we had said that if the robbers, if the people who are forcing you to make the neder say, prove to me that this is truma by limiting your wife from you in the form of a neder, and he says, forget that, my wife and my kids, machlokes beishamai beis hillel, beishamai omrim mishtam muteres ubanav asurin, beis hillel omrim elu ve'elu mutar. So says the Gemara, Rav Huna Tana, we have a Mishnah, we have a Brisa that doesn't really work with our Mishnah, because the inferences that we're about to see from this Brisa, they create conflict for us. Here's 2/3 of the way down. Beishamai omrim lo yiftach lo b'shvua. In our Mishnah, if you look at the second line of the page, it said lo yiftach lo b'neder. So the difference between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel and the Brisa and in the Mishnah, Beis Shammai's language was lo yiftach lo b'neder. In the Brisa, it is lo yiftach lo b'shvua. One huge difference, which we'll get to in a moment. Beis Hillel omrim af yiftach lo b'shvua. And over here in this Brisa, 2/3 of the way down, Beis Hillel is of the opinion that he can even start with a shvua. But Beis Hillel, for 3 lines down from the top of the page, says af yiftach lo, but without the word shvua, implying that he's talking about a neder like Beis Shammai was. Okay, so now the Gemara presents the inferences that are problematic. Le Beis Shammai, in this new brisa that we have here, b'shvuhu de lo yiftach lo, habeneder yiftach lo. It implies from the brisa that he could be poseach, he could initiate a neder on his own without the robbers forcing him to do so. But how can you say that? V'hatnan, we learned in the Mishnah at the top of this page, Beis Shammai omrim lo yiftach lo b'neder. So the implication of the brisa doesn't fit with our Mishnah. And furthermore, miftachu de lo yiftach lo b'shvua. Over here, in this brisa, it seems to say that he's not allowed to initiate in regards to a shvua, hamedar neder b'shvua, but he is allowed to make a commitment with a shvua, which is also against our Mishnah. That's not Beis Shammai omrim b'kol nodrin chutz mi b'shvua. The first machlokas we saw in our Mishnah, another problem with Beis Shammai is that you're not allowed to make a shvua in our Mishnah. Yet over here in the brisa, it seems like you are allowed to make a shvua as long as you're not being posech, as long as you're not initiating. So the Gemara provides 2 answers to this stira, and let's just remember that the stira is between our Mishnah and this new brisa. Answer number 1 is Tana Masnisin ben Neder lehodiecha kochan de Beis Shammai. Our Mishnah, the one that we started with today and that wraps up to the top of Kaf Ches Amud Aleph, the reason why it said the language of Neder was Lahodiach HaKochan de Beis Shammai, that Beis Shammai was of the opinion that he's not allowed to initiate even by a Neder, a very, very extreme Shita. And then Tana Brisa b'Shvua, the reason why the Brisa focused on Shvua was Lahodiach HaKochan de Beis Hillel, that you're even allowed to initiate by a Shvua, 3 steps apart from one another, very far. That's the machlokas between them. So really there's no stira between our Mishnah and the Brisa. Our Mishnah was focusing on the extreme nature of the Shita of Beis Shammai, and the Brisa was focusing on the extreme nature of Beis Hillel. That's why in the Mishnah it focused on the language of Neder, and why in the Brisa it focused on the language of Shua. A very good answer. The Gemara then provides another answer, which is Rav Ashi Amar Hachi Ktani. You've misunderstood entirely. This new brisa that we just saw, your whole question is a house of cards. Why? Because that whole brisa that we just learned was talking about something different. Beis Shammai omrim ein she'ela b'shua. Ein she'ela b'shua means that you can't recant on your shvua. There's no outsies. You're done. You make a shvua, you're done. However, Beis Hillel omrim yesh she'ela mi b'shua. That's not true. There is a way to get out of it. So that brisa was dealing with something else. And because the brisa was dealing with something else, so therefore there's no stira anymore. A new Mishnah, and all connected to the same thing of nodrin laharagin lacharaman u'lemochsen. So the Gemara says, the Mishnah says 4 lines from the bottom on Kaf Ches Amud Aleph, and we're just going to be learning to the 2 dots, which is toward the bottom on Kaf Ches Amud Beis, 4 lines from the bottom, and it's a short page, so not too much more to go for tonight. Says the Gemara, Hare netios ha'elu korban. These saplings that are planted are going to be a korban. They're going to be sanctified. Im einon niktzatos, if they aren't cut down. Talis zu korban in einon nisrafes. This talis is going to be a korban. It's going to be sanctified if they're not burnt. How often do talisim get burnt? The Gemara is going to discuss this. That's a very strange parameter.
Well, it's around the radiator.
Yeah, it's probably a bad idea. Talisim don't belong on the radiators. And if your radiator is hot enough to make your talis combust, there's something wrong with your radiator too. That's very, very hot. Huh? Yeah, certainly the fancy schmancy plastic ones. Like the thread that is silvery. I wonder if it would melt that. Because if it's actually silver, that's easy to melt at that temperature. No, what's the melting temperature for silver? It's pretty low.
Of what?
Silver.
Oh, it's hundreds of degrees.
Yeah, but silver thread is it's not solid silver. Silver thread is like a.
Well, silver thread.
Yeah, it's not super thin, no?
It's probably not made out of silver. It's probably silver color.
Oh, I wonder. All right. Okay.
Base.
So that's what the Gemara said, that if the person says, if this talis doesn't light up in flames, then it's going to be considered a korban. That's the Resha. And the Gemara says in those cases, yesh la pidyon. Strange language. Yesh la pidyon means that not only does it have sanctity, but because it has sanctity, if you wanted to then transfer the kedusha, you need to be poded that onto a coin or something like that. Second part of the Mishnah, Hare netios ha'elu korban ad sheyiktsu, a different language. These saplings are going to be a korban until they are cut. They're going to be holy until they're cut. And talazu korban ad shetisaref. This talis is going to be a korban until it burns down. Again, a strange language. Ein lahem pidyon. In these cases, there's no kedusha, no need for pidyon. So the Gemara is bothered by the language of pidyon. And the Gemara says, "V'lisnei kedushos ve'ein kedushos." Why does our Mishnah use the language of pidyon and ein pidyon? You should be using the language of kadosh and ein kadosh. Why are you using this strange language? So says the Gemara, I did the boile misna seifa in them pidyon, tananami reshe yesh them pidyon. We had a greater reason in the seifa to use the language of pidyon, and therefore, for the sake of symmetry in the Mishnah, in the resha, we also use the language of pidyon. Heichi nodar, what was the language? So says the Gemara, Amar Meimar be'omer, it must be im eina niktsasos hayom. Think about it. If you would have said these trees are going to be kadosh if they're not cut down, but you don't give me a time frame. In effect, it means they're never going to become kadosh, because the parameter of determining whether or not it's kadosh is an unknown. They'll never become kadosh. So Ameimar says it has to be that we're adding in the word hayom. Says the Gemara, and therefore v'avar hayom v'lo niktatu. And if the day then goes by and it wasn't yet cut down, then we have a moment, we have a threshold, we have a moment in time when it becomes kadosh. Says the Gemara, but if he did say hayom in our Mishnah, im kain lama li lemeimar pshita, that should be obvious that that's true. That's not I don't need a Mishnah to tell me that. That's a regular condition that's put in place to make something kadosh. Says the Gemara, lo tzricha, we must be talking about a case to kigon deika zika nefisha. There's a tremendous wind that's outside, and that's what all of this is about. Okay? You live in a place where the wind is crazy. When I was in YU between Belfer Hall and I can't remember the name of the other building, there was like this massive wind tunnel. So I couldn't remember what it's called. So the building in between the buildings, if you were to walk by it, went from like 60 degrees to like 40 degrees to like 60 degrees. It was so windy. One of the architects did not think that through. It was very, very windy. So therefore, we were talking about a case in our Mishnah where there's a Zika Nefisha. It says the Gemara, I can prove it to you that our Mishnah was talking about a case of Zika Nefisha. And as I already shared with you, we're going to be learning this from the fact that fire is uncommon to consume a talis. It says the Gemara, after all, halfway down, we have a strange case by talis. Is that like a normal thing to happen to a talis? No. And it must be only in a case could go into ika deleka. I make this condition when I see a fire in my neighbor's yard, and I'm like, this is going to be kadosh if it doesn't burn down. Why? Because there's a context. There's a fire in my neighbor's house. So therefore, hachanami the ika zika nefisha, must be that just like by the talis, there's a unique case going on where there's a fire that risks consuming the talis. So too over here, it must be that there's zika nefisha, that there's extra wind. And I might have thought I might have thought that he only made this neder because he had concluded that he wouldn't be able to save it. And therefore, mishum hachi kanadar, and therefore maybe the neder shouldn't count. Kamash malan, that the neder actually does count. That is not a scenario for exclusion. We're going to stop right here at Hare Netios. We'll pick up with this tomorrow night, Emir Hashem, for another blot. Wishing you all a beautiful night.